No, allora parliamo così un po' sulle sonate, se hai delle
Sì,
domande.
sì. Domande sullo strumento, sul pedale,
Su tutto.
sulle dinamiche,
Su
cose...
tutto.
Ok. And of course, speaking about the grand, the idea of the expansion, many of these sonatas are also called grand sonata, which is not something that before it was done by Haydn. So
Number
it's
4, Opus
exactly,
7. Opus
exactly.
7
So we are talking
is a symphonic
absolutely.
piece. The grand sonatas are symphonic
Yeah.
in nature. But the piano, I think Beethoven was probably the first composer. I don't want to do any to make any criticism about what came before him, but Beethoven treated the piano as if it was an orchestra. You cannot play Beethoven as a simple piano piece. You need to basically orchestrate it. Let us not forget that the piano is the least interesting instrument of all of them. If you can play the violin, one sound is a beautiful sound, and you say, what a beautiful tone. You can say that about piano, it has a beautiful tone or an ugly tone, but it's not in the same way. And the sound does not sustain in the piano. It has a limited duration. And therefore, for instance, when you have chords, you cannot simply balance them in two hands, which is the most important. You have to balance each note in the chord in both hands, as if they were played by different instruments. It can be a woodwind chord or a string chord, but you cannot just balance. You cannot really play the melody if it is at the top and all the other notes in the chords the same way, because they have different, they provide different opportunities for the theme. And the preoccupation with harmony is one of the most important things for me. You cannot play Beethoven only melodically or only rhythmically. In fact, you cannot play anything. Tonal music without the harmony. But in Beethoven, it is one of the most important instruments that he had to create tension. And the tension that he creates is already evident in his early period. I think his pure early period goes until Opus 14. From 22, Opus 22, you're already going into the next step, the so-called middle period. It has 22, it has a sonata with a funeral march, it has the 3 Opus 31 number 1, which is so wonderful when you play them together because each one has a completely different character. 31 number 1 goes almost back in style with a slow movement that could have been composed by Bellini, and the Schubertian last movement. Opus 31 number 2, the so-called Tempest Sonata. It's not clear whether it was called like this
Absolutely
because
not.
it reminded people of Shakespeare. Tempest, I don't think so. But it is a very dramatic piece with extraordinarily dramatic first movement, a very stately slow movement, and the last movement, which is a slow tarantella, very slow tarantella, with insisting syncopations in the left hand. The right hand plays da-dee-da-dum, ba-dee-da-dum, ba-dee-da-dum, and the left hand plays ya-ba, ya-ba, ya-ba. All these elements have to be brought together. And Opus 31 number 3 is one of the virtuoso sonatas, without a real slow movement, with great virtuosity and great elan. And then continues. I leave now the two little ones, Opus 49, because they have this opus because they were published later, but they were much earlier. And then you have Opus 53, the famous Waldstein Sonata, a very original sonata, Opus 54, in 2 movements, unique up to that point. He then repeated the exercise in Opus 78, and the most famous of all, the Appassionata.
Absolutely. And as we arrive into this middle period, we see, especially with the Waldstein, that also the notation, the information that is on the page for performers, for pianists, especially in the 3rd movement, we see something that was already very clear to the critics of the time when they heard Beethoven. The first criticism they had is that they used too much pedal. If we think that the piano school of music, the most virtuosic one, was Clementi, was coming from the Italian school of piano playing, and it was all a digital school, while Beethoven already thinking about the orchestral sound, how to sustain the sound, how to sustain the intention, how to sustain the drama. He was improvising, and his long improvisation always were, we can call it messy, because compared to the standard of piano playing of the time, it was extremely powerful. We have critics, we have articles that describe that, and always with a lot of pedal to provide something that the piano at the time probably could not provide.
Only in certain passages.
Exactly.
When he wanted the effect. He doesn't write so that you can play with a lot of pedal all the time. The Waldstein Sonata, you cannot use a lot of pedal in the first movement. You kill the music. You kill the music because there is no clarity. And the last movement, you have to play with the original pedal, even though they say, but I was not there at the beginning of the 19th century, they say that the sustaining pedal was much less powerful than it is now. But the modern pianos can take that.
Of course.
The modern pianos can take that, and I'm a firm believer that when there is a pedal marking, in 99% of the cases, it should be observed.
One thing that is very interesting also about Beethoven, I mean, we are talking about how does one come close to a composer, how does one understand the message, the music that he wrote. And I see today, in the last, let's say, 20 years, a trend in the editions of music that is sort of going back to the roots. So we just want to have the so-called Urtext edition that basically just give us the supposed message that comes from Beethoven. And of course, these are all wonderful. They are wonderfully printed, and there is beautiful research done, behind them. But one thing that was very important for you, I think, lately was the study of the Bülow edition of Beethoven.
Well, I studied. I started playing Beethoven sonatas a long time ago, when I was 8. So it's 70 years ago, and I studied from what was then available as Urtext, which is much less than it was now. And then, of course, I got the real Urtext editions later on. But I always studied the editions that were given to us by great masters, Bülow, d'Albert, Schnabel. From all of this, you can learn so much. Schnabel is, if you want, the most intellectual. And he writes, for instance, in order to get the flexibility of tempo, he writes a different metronome every 3 or 4 bars, whenever it comes. I find that a little over-intellectualized. But if you take it as a thought of how to develop your own expressivity, can be very helpful. D'Albert must have been a very great pianist, of course, but his edition is not so important. I think it's very useful to read the editions of great musicians who took the trouble to write the comments. Bülow is a very special case. First of all, unfortunately, there is edition of the sonatas only from the Waldstein to the end. So the first 20 sonatas, there is no Bülow edition. Probably the most important Bülow edition is of the Diabelli variations, because that explains so much. That explains so much about how to read the text, what he was thinking. He was quite a good composer, not a great composer, but he wrote some very good symphonic pieces. He must have been a miraculous pianist. He was the first one to play all the Beethoven sonatas by heart in the 19th century. He must have been a phenomenal pianist, and his edition is extremely interesting and very useful, because it gives you all kinds of information. Some very technical about fingerings and things, always explaining why. He understood that you don't finger the difficult passages in the piano according to only to the comfort of the hands, but according to the musical discourse. Very often recommends on repeated notes not to play them with the same finger. Pa-pam, pam-pam. Of course, because it cannot be expressive. And the changing of the finger is really very, very important. And there are many technical advice. But he also explains harmonic developments, the importance of certain chords, and sometimes also what other ideas it gave him about things outside the music. I find Bülow the most important, entertaining, and wonderful edition.